Hey everybody, it's Kneecap here, and in this video we're going to be talking about trinkets for Retribution Paladins in 10.2 Season 3, which will be coming out here hopefully soon. We don't know the exact date yet. And yeah, so I've been on the PTR testing out these trinkets. I actually did before, but the dungeon trinkets were not out yet on the vendor to test, and so therefore I did not end up putting out that video. I just deleted it and said forget about it. But I have tested the raid trinkets already once, and this is my second time testing the raid trinkets. Huge caveat here: I'm one person doing testing on a dummy. This is going to be single target focused here. When we actually go through and talk about the trinkets, I'll mention things about Mythic Plus about them as well. But this is single target damage because that's the easiest thing to test. And none of this is going to be perfect, right? None of this is going to be perfect, but it is a good indicator. If something is super low on my test, then it's probably not very good. And if something is super high, then it probably is pretty good, right? And so you can kind of break things down into tiers. That's kind of how I like to do it for this. And obviously later on when we can run tons of simulations on raid bots or whatever, we can have a little bit more of an accurate takeaway once everything is set and any new rotation or new talents are discovered, or new talent builds or whatever discovered to play with the new tier set or anything like that. We can get more definite stuff, but this is good to know going into it and have an idea of what trinkets you're going to be wanting to go for and things like that. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with just some data. Just plug some stuff into a spreadsheet here. I'm no spreadsheet master, but I just plug some stuff into a spreadsheet just to kind of have a little bit of a visual here on some of this stuff here. And then we will actually go into the game and talk about each trinket as well. So we have, if we just look at the data, so none, this is just with no trinket on, right? So no trinket on is just going to be my base damage, and then the added damage is going to, on the graph at least, is kind of the red. And then I also put down the eye level of the trinkets, and then I did DPS per eye level. Now it's important to note that that's not how trinkets scale. They don't just scale all linearly as with eye level or whatever. But I needed some sort of reference point because they were such a huge item level difference. The trinkets from the dungeons off the vendor are only 447, and the trinkets from the raid off the vendor are like at the item level they drop in the raid or whatever. So it's like a huge item level difference, like between 447 and 470. So 23 item levels in some cases, which is quite large. So let's just go through some of these. So, and we will go through the trinkets. If you don't know what these trinkets are, we are going to go through them in the game with the tooltips and everything like that. So we have Ashes of Embersoul. This is a raid trinket. It added about 3,500 DPS onto my base. And then it was, the most important number I'm looking at here is the DPS per item level number, even though that's not how it scales. I understand that. 7.6 there. So this is kind of like mid-range, right? So we kind of have tiers. You'll see these tiers kind of develop. We have Pip's Friendship Badge. This is just like a static trinket that gives you some stats. It's actually pretty good. It's pretty consistent overall. This had an 11, so this is kind of in that top tier. So anything over 10 is pretty much going to be like in that top tier of trinket. Branch of the Ancients. So this trinket does damage on use, basically. Again, it's another kind of a mid-tier trinket. Augury of Primal Flame. So this is a trinket that's going to have a lot of different things. So a lot of people, when they do testing, they just do their opener on testing. And this is one where if you do your opener and it procs on your opener, you're going to think this is the best trinket ever made. Basically, if Augury procs during your wings, it is very good. And it'll be higher. It'll jump up to the top tier if it always does, but you can't guarantee that. And if it procs outside of your wings, it ends up being just kind of like a critical strike stat stick and adds almost nothing to your damage. So it's one of those that can sometimes be super high damage and sometimes it can be super low damage, and it's kind of RNG based. So, I think it's much better for other classes and specs than Ret Paladins, probably, just because we need our wings on for this to be really good for us, right? We need that that crit with our wings and pumping out that damage for Augury to really be good. And you'll see why if you don't know what Augury does when we go over the tooltip. Firex Rage Heart. This is like a tank trinket almost. It's not really a tank trinket, but it's a trinket that does damage to yourself and gives you like a shield or whatever. And this is a very strong trinket. Of course, this is the highest item level as well. Trinket. So, and if let's say this thing scales really good with item level, then that's kind of going to be inflating its damage, because it can go the other way too, right? This thing could be inflated with damage because it's the highest item level trinket. But this would be in the top tier based on my testing. Then we go into the dungeon trinkets. We have the accelerating sand glass from the mega dungeon. This is again like a mid-tier thing. We have the Mirror of Tomorrow from the dungeon as well, from the mega dungeon. This is actually a pretty good trinket. It's still kind of that mid-tier, but it's like the high end of the mid-tier. Gore Encrusted Butcher Block. This is one of the worst trinkets. This is a dungeon trinket. Spiked Counterweight. This was very surprising to me. The Spiked Counterweight, I consistently was performing. I had to keep doing it because I thought it was just an outlier, right? Spiked Counterweight, I consistently kept performing very, very well. So even if my number's a bit high, because I'm just one person testing this, and I could get multiple outliers in a row, right? The fact that I'm getting this high of a number every time tells me that it's probably at least in the top tier, even if it's not the top as this would suggest. This would suggest this is like the best trinket. Maybe it is. But it would at least suggest that it's probably in the top tier if it's not the top trinket. Then we have Nightmare Eggshell. This is going to be a really bad trinket. Once again, this trinket's actually really good. It's not necessarily really good, but it's probably more of a mid-tier or an acceptable trinket for people who dual wield. But it's not great when you have a two-handed weapon. Might of the Ocean, mid-tier trinket. And then we have the Cataclysmic Signet brand. This is actually, I would consider this a top tier. It doesn't quite break that 10.0 that I just talked about. But the Signet brand actually, once you get your stacks, is when it does this damage. So it's kind of like imagine the anvil. You know, you have to press your anvil. Once you press it 5 times, you're doing a lot of damage with the anvil. This does it on its own. It's passive. You don't have to press a button. But again, it takes a few minutes for you to get up to. It takes like, for a Ret Paladin, like 2.5, 3 minutes or so. I can't remember exactly. To get up to 15 stacks on average. It's going to vary. And this is really good for a long fight, right? So if you're in a really long raid fight on Prog or whatever, or if you are in a Mythic Plus and you can stay in combat, right? This would also be really good for that. If you can stay in combat, the Cataclysm Signet brand is actually quite strong and quite good. And so let's just go through the tiers real quick. Absolute top tier, I would say, is probably Spiked Counterweight, Phyrex's Rage Heart, Pip's Friendship Badge, and then the Signet brand, assuming, again, especially for Prog, assuming it's going to be a bit of a longer fight. I would say 4.5 to 5 minutes plus, then it goes into that top tier level at least. So we kind of have 4 in that top tier. And then with Augury, I would say is kind of like a maybe. Like, do you want to take the chance? Is there some way to game the proc to have it happen on opener every single time? And then is it going to be a short fight? Because then you already have that on your opener. Is it going to be like a 3-minute fight? Because then it could be really good. Mythic Plus, it has tons of possibilities as well in there, and we can get into that. So that's kind of like one that's close. And then when we have mid-tier, we kind of have Mirror of Tomorrow and Ashes of Ember Soul, Branch of the Ancient, kind of like leading the way there with like Accelerating Hourglass kind of on the bottom end with Might of the Ocean. And then at the absolute ones you probably want to avoid are Nightmare Eggshell and the Gore Crusted Butcher Block, which are quite low and not really doing much for you there. So let's go ahead and look through the trinkets now, and we can kind of talk about what they do. Let's move this out of the way. So we'll just go through the order I have them in my bags, which might be the order that I have them on the chart as well. Ashes of Ember Soul. So this gives you haste as a main stat, which is good. It has a use. You draw the power from the remnants of Ember Soul, granting you a bunch of strength for 20 seconds, decaying every 3 seconds. Once this effect ends, you become burned out, losing haste before recovering, for 60 seconds before recovering. So it's a kiss curse, but then it does have something that you can't test as well. So this, the thing you can't test could perhaps send this into, I assume you can't test it because I'm assuming what it does, I guess. When circumstances are dire, which I believe, I think I read it was 20% health or something like that, you actually get the buff without the decay. So if that is how it works, I'm not positive on that. So if that's how it works, you get that one extra proc of it, you know, maybe that puts it up into that top tier. If you factor in that, the circumstances are dire part, but it's basically just a haste thing that gives you a ton of strength right when you use it. So when you use it during your wings, what's the cooldown? 2-minute cooldown. So you're going to use it with your wings every single time, and you are going to do a ton of damage every other wings, basically every other you know, avenging wrath. You're going to do a ton of damage with Ashes of Embersoul. It's a very solid trinket, even if you know, it was towards the top of the mid tier anyways. But with that extra proc, who knows, maybe this sends it into the stratosphere and makes it even better. Next we will do Branch of the Tormented Ancient. This is pretty simple. It summons roots around you. They break almost instantly, and it does a bunch of damage, Shadow Flame damage, and it damages increase per enemy struck. So this is actually better to do on Cleave, better to do in Mythic Plus, technically, at least for a little bit of a burst damage there. So because the damage increases per enemy struck. It's still pretty good on single target anyways, but yeah, it's the roots, I did test it out. Blessing of Freedom does not break the roots, which I think would be pretty cool, but it doesn't really matter. You pretty much instantly break them with your attacks anyways. Pip's Friendship Badge. This is just kind of like a weird stat thing. It starts with strength, but you join the Dream Team, gaining 253 of Pip's Mastery, whatever's versatility, or some critical strike, based on your current best friend, and the best friend just cycles through like while you're fighting. Your spells and abilities have a chance to give you even more of those stats, basically. And you know, it's pretty consistent. It's just you constantly have a bunch of stats, basically. You obviously want it to proc the big stat number during your wings and stuff like that. And then, you know, especially if it's like verse or something like that during your wings, is pretty good. But yeah, that's a pretty solid trinket, pretty much top tier, I would say, and a very just, you know, like I said, solid trinket that you be happy if you got it, even if it's not the most you know, luxurious or whatever. Augury. So Augury, this is again critical strike rating, which doesn't help us a ton unless your crit's low. If your crit's very low, then it actually probably does help you. Your spells and abilities have a low chance, and it's a very low chance, to grant Annihilating Flame for 20 seconds, making your critical strikes deal 50% additional damage, and then the flame does a bunch of damage before whatever, and this increases per enemy struck as well. So I think this is going to be really good for Mythic Plus, especially, you know, if you're just going for pure damage, right? But it's going to have to proc during your wings. Now, through a bunch of pulls on Mythic Plus, there are going to be some pulls where it just procs during your wings. That's just going to happen. In a raid encounter, unfortunately, like when this does not proc during your wings, which we talked about when we were looking at the spreadsheet there, when this doesn't proc during your wings, it literally feels like it's doing nothing, unfortunately. But when it procs during your wings, it feels really good. I will say too, since it does do critical strikes during execute phase with Hammer of Wrath, at least that would like increase that damage as well. So there is that as well, which I wasn't really testing that. So it does have a little bit of added bonus during execute phase for Ret Paladins, because we can make Hammer of Wrath always crit. So it does have a little bit of bonus value there, and it doesn't take much to put this into a top tier trinket. So who knows? For Mythic Plus, it probably is already. And then for single target, you know, maybe just having that, having the execute phase crits with Hammer of Wrath, maybe that sets it up into the top tier. Fire Axe Rage Heart. So this is interesting, because at first I thought this was a tank trinket. Deal damage to you and nearby enemies every 3 seconds while in combat, and use given to Rage Heart for 10 seconds, absorbing a bunch of damage, but inflicting damage on yourself and then lashing out with strikes as well. This also does more damage per enemy struck up to 5. So it's good for cleave and AoE in theory. It has a 2-minute cooldown as well. So you use this with your wings, whatever, just in your macro or whatever, however you want to do it. And so Fryrex Rage Heart, again, this simmed really high, but it could, again, this was the highest item level thing, and maybe this thing scales really well with item level. I don't know. That could be why, but this one was pretty good for me. Next up, we have the Sandglass. This one is strength, and it gives you haste, basically. It's not just an equipped trinket there. And, you know, it's kind of a mid-tier level trinket. The Gore Butcher Block, this is strength, and your attacks have a chance to give you crit. You know, if it gives you the crit during, not during your wings, I guess, because you don't really need more crit during your wings. So it kind of just is antithetical to Ret Paladin, because when we pop our cooldown, we get a bunch of crit, and we don't need more crit at that point, and that's when we do all of our damage. So it's like, I guess you would want it to proc during your non-wings execution sentence, right? And then that would give you the most value for it, but it's just not that good. We have the Mirror of Tormented Tomorrow, or Fractured Tomorrows, and this gives you a ton of strength and summons a little guy that fights with you, like a copy of yourself. Again, this was actually a pretty decent trinket. It was like in the mid-tier. Just a bunch of strength, on use, strong on use thing. Nothing special to write about, but it was pretty good. Spiked Counterweight. This gives you haste base, which is good. And then your melee attacks have a chance to deal a bunch. It's going to change based on your gear. 155,000 damage, and make the target take 15% more damage for 15 seconds, up to 43,000. So that up to number is not very big, obviously, right? But it's going to be 43,000 more damage. And if it is in a execution sentence window, that's 43,000 extra damage into your execution sentence as well, which does matter. And that could be why it's performing so well for me as well. That is hitting into execution sentence or whatever. And then, you know, it's just doing a nice big fat amount of damage as well with chance on hit. So again, this trinket, for whatever reason, I didn't expect it to be this good when I was testing it, but again, I think it's at least in the top tier, even if it's not, even if I was having outlier performances to make it, you know, quote unquote the best, I think it's at least going to be in the top tier. Nightmare Eggshell, we talked about this already a little bit about how it's better for dual wielding. Your melee attacks have a chance to grant you haste, which it like goes over 20 seconds, increases every over 20 seconds or whatever. And, you know, this trinket's not terrible for dual wield, but it's just not that good for two-handed users like Ret Paladins. So unfortunately, pretty bad trinket there. Not one you really want to target. And the last one I think I have equipped, which is the Signet brand. We can kind of go over it more, but again, this is just one of those that's really good for longer fights. So it bases strength, and equip your melee attacks and abilities have a chance to brand your target, dealing 10,000 fire damage or so over 6 seconds, and grant you fire starter stacking up to 15 times, damage increase per stack, a maximum of 127,000. While above 5 stacks, you also deals 50% of its damage to you. At 15 stacks, enemies near your target suffer 10% of the damage dealt. Firestarter decays while out of combat and fades entirely after 15 seconds. So as long as you can stay in combat, this is incredibly strong. Like if it's a 7-minute single target fight, let's say a 6 or 7 minute single target fight in a raid, Cataclysmic Signet Brand is going to be really strong. On a tyrannical boss, on a high key, Signet Brand is going to be pretty strong. Yeah, I guess not so much that, because I guess even tyrannical bosses don't last that long. But on a, if you are in combat for the entire Mythic Plus, because you're staying in combat with Spiteful or you're just chain pulling or whatever, as long as you're staying in combat, this thing's going to be extremely strong for Mythic Plus, and I think it's also going to be strong again for Prog in the raid. So I think this is kind of like my sleeper trinket, the one that I think is kind of the best in a way. Not necessarily the best, but just it's going to be very consistent damage, and we can handle taking damage as our Paladins, so we don't have to worry about that. I just think it's going to be quite strong. So Cataclysm Signet Brand's right up there with for me, and it's one of the ones that, as I said, I tested the raid trinkets already once, and this is one that's just performed consistently every single time I've tested it. It's very consistent. It's idiot proof, whatever you want to call it. So I really like Cataclysm Signet Brand. So yeah, once again, that's all the trinkets. We can pop this back up. But yeah, that's all the trinkets that there were to test on the PTR. Again, none of this stuff is like perfect. It's important to know that. You shouldn't say that, well, spiked counterweight's definitely the best because I said it's the best. But what you can say is it's probably a really good trinket. That's fair to say. And you don't have to say that gore crusted butcher block is the absolute worst trinket. But what you can say is it's probably not one that rep paladins are going to use. Right? This is generalities. This is just one guy simming. I always want to point that out because we're going to get some real numbers when we can start simming all this stuff and everything is set in stone. We'll get some real numbers. And I expect it to be similar to what I came up with, but it might be different and the order might be different. So that's it for this one, guys. Hopefully more ret stuff to talk about. Hopefully some changes, some buffs, whatever we might get here. I don't want changes that are bad, so I guess I'd rather have no changes than bad changes. But yeah, hopefully some more stuff to talk about in the future. But this is kind of how the trinkets are looking right now. As always, I do ask you to please subscribe to the channel. It helps me out a lot. Other than that, everybody have a good one.